Let me start this off with this. I'm very pro-consumer. My videos on the poor state of consumerism within the gaming space should tell you this. But after hearing some of the absolute dribble being spouted by people on Jim Ryan's retirement, my opinion gets put in a very peculiar situation. I'm all for having a dislike for his very blatant want to make more money for the company, but what has Jim Ryan done that makes him so evil? Because from my standpoint, he just seems like a normal CEO of any other company. The sins often associated with Jim Ryan are as followed: increasing gaming subscription prices, the closing of Japan studios while being less committed to Japan, and the shutting down of old online services like the PS3 and the Vita, while not providing a good way to play and buy those games on newer systems. Okay, now you know some of his most common sins, let's extrapolate. Sony did pull the trigger and increase their game prices to $70, which in turn set off a chain reaction within the gaming space, but if Sony didn't, someone else would have. The current state of video game budgets, like I've discussed in previous videos, is terrible. Nearly every video game Sony produces is probably in the 200 millions to make, and that's without marketing. Game prices have stayed the same for the last decade, while the budgets for those games have done the opposite. I'm all for disliking paying more for video games, but acting like Sony is to blame for all this is just outright insane. Moreover, Sony's increase on prices to their subscription-based services is also not exclusive to them. Xbox and the so touted and loved Phil Spencer are doing the same with Game Pass, and may I remind you that Xbox over a year ago tried increasing the base price of Xbox Gold while offering nothing new, and without the internet's backlash it would have happened. I'm not going to sit here and defend Sony on this point. Increasing prices while people are struggling to pay for food is not something I condone, but I'm noticing something. Why is Jim Ryan hailed as evil and Phil Spencer as saint when they both want and do the same thing? But more on this later. Sony Japan Studios are most commonly known for their work on Bloodborne, Ape Escape and other classic video games, but more recently are known for being the makers of the IP Astro Bot, which has seemingly become the new face of PlayStation. Japan Studios is what I would call a victim of the industry, an incredibly talented bunch of people whose ideas never resulted in a game that sold well enough to warrant their existence, which is why Sony dissolved them to make Team Asobi to work on Astro Bot games and not a result of Sony's Americanization. It is correct that Sony is focusing more on Western markets, but that doesn't mean that they don't care for Japan. Japan's current gaming market is shifting more towards PCs and portable devices than ever before, resulting in Sony spending more time investing in Western countries where their console needs growth. What Sony is doing is smart. They almost always will be a household name in Japan because after all they're a Japanese company, but this notion that Sony is done investing in Japanese IP is just provably false. Sony has committed millions of dollars to IPs like Street Fighter and Final Fantasy, which are both made and marketed towards Japanese audiences. People attributing Sony's westernization to Jim Ryan is just also provably false. Sony's headquarters moved from Japan in 2016 when Jim Ryan was not CEO but Sean Layden was, and the same thing can be said about Sony's distancing from certain types of Japanese games. What Jim Ryan did here was continue a trend Sony was already walking towards, yet Jim Ryan is accountable for all of it apparently. I understand a CEO is a figurehead for criticism, but blaming one man for what Sony was already doing is mental given the situation. The biggest criticism you can levy at Jim Ryan is his unwillingness to work and make systems to facilitate old Sony IPs, while also then shutting down old marketplaces where they previously had homes. Personally, this is the only piece of criticism that I find actually holds weight. Jim Ryan, in previous interviews, has downplayed the love and significance of old Sony titles and IPs, and Sony's unwillingness to provide a substantial library of old titles to PlayStation Plus is telling. Jim Ryan's take on old IPs is very short-sighted in my opinion. Game preservation is important, and giving people a way to purchase childhood games is something I think Xbox is doing well at. But if this is the only thing Jim Ryan is bad at, then why do people hate him so much? As I've said, most of what Jim Ryan is said to have done is just provably false, and this notion that Jim Ryan was bad for PlayStation knowing he helped them in many areas is crazy. Jim was massively influential in Sony's move to porting PlayStation exclusive titles to PC, which in turn has given Sony a new audience to market towards, resulting in Sony IPs becoming more successful. I understand being tentative about his words on making more always online games, but nothing has shown me yet that Sony's focus is away from single player experiences. I've always taken these words as PlayStation want an IP like Call of Duty to rake in millions a year so they can invest even more in their already incredible studios, and not as this dystopian future where every game they make is Fortnite. So many people point towards the notion that Sony told him to step down on the back of the Activision-Microsoft merger, and while I think that that's not the case, I'm not inside the mind of a billion-dollar company. I think the most likely thing that happened is Jim wanted to step down, so on his way out he did the unlikable thing of raising subscription prices so the new CEO didn't have to. Reflecting back on Jim Ryan's tenure at Sony, I think it's fair to say that what he did for the company was good. He continued and created successes in untapped markets that Sony were afraid to try. You can call Jim all you want, but an unsuccessful CEO for PlayStation is not one of them. I think it's time I re-asked the question of why is Jim Ryan hailed as evil and Phil Spencer as saint when they both want and do the same thing, because from my view, Phil deserves more criticism than Jim Ryan does. Game Pass and the many acquisitions Phil has made have been great for Xbox, but outside of that, what does he do but pander to the internet when something goes wrong? Phil, just like Jim Ryan, has done many anti-consumer things, but unlike Jim, Phil hides his misdoings under the disguise of someone that just loves video games. games. People have created a false image of a CEO that's one goal is to make more money for the investors. I think Phil has been instrumental to Xbox. Game Pass has given Microsoft the way back into an industry that they were once thought of leaving. But acting like he's the guy who will always do the pro-consumer thing is just wrong, and his track record proves this. Phil on multiple occasions has enacted in anti-consumer activities, and the big one people would think of is his wormy nature around the time Xbox were acquiring Bethesda, where Phil never gave a factual statement on if Bethesda games like Starfield were going to be Xbox exclusive or not. The reason I bring Phil into a conversation about Jim Ryan is to prove the dishonesty and biases that people have on these CEOs because of their words and not their actions. At the end of the day, both companies act in anti-consumer practices, and being blind to one of them only dilutes the conversation. The conclusion of all of this is that Jim Ryan is not truly as bad as many would have you think, and his actions on the PlayStation might not be enough what you wanted, but factually he was good for them. People often associate public dislike of someone to be the same as company disapproval, and in this situation that's just wrong. I think Jim's words on old Sony titles is what has given him such a bad reputation within the gaming community, and his cutthroat approach to internal Sony studios didn't help him either. The one thing I want you to take away from this video is don't idealize CEOs because you like something they've said. Phil Spencer is a great CEO for Xbox, but just like Jim Ryan, he acts in the interests of Xbox and not the users. Sometimes in the interest of the company, they do something good for the consumers, and my example of this would be Game Pass. Microsoft needed a way back into the industry at their lowest point, so they made Game Pass to gain favor with consumers, which resulted in what you see today, where it seems like Phil Spencer can do no wrong. Actions are everything, and judging them by them is what we should be doing going forward. If there's anything I fear about Jim Ryan stepping down, it's that the person replacing him might be the actual image of what people thought Jim Ryan was.